The purpose of this lecture is to provide a broad overview of the field of teaching English as a second or foreign language, to define and explain some of the key terminology we'll be using throughout the course, and also to provide a foundation for the various teaching techniques and strategies we'll be looking at in every module. For that reason, as you will see, this lecture is not so much about methods as principles. As you read in the first chapter of the textbook, the language teaching profession has been through a long series of methods, or phases you might say, actually going back hundreds of years. Some of these were based on analysis of the language and focused mostly on grammar and translation. This allowed students to pass tests, to read and translate, but gave them almost no ability to communicate. And by the way, this approach is still used in many classes throughout the world. Other methods, more recently, were based on scientific theories coming from structural linguistics, behavioral psychology, and first language acquisition. Recently, some highly specialized so-called designer methods promised fast and miraculous results that would allow students to skip the years of study and practice needed to reach full proficiency in a second language. Most recently, many teachers, or I could say the majority of teachers, have adopted one of the many variations on the communicative approach, which placed authentic, competent communication at the forefront. Many language professionals describe the current period as a post-methodological era, in which we draw freely on many of the techniques and practices of the past. Penny the author of our textbook, refers to her own approach and that of many others as, quote, post-communicative, a common-sense eclectic approach that once again draws freely on many existing methods. The purpose of this course, however, is not to describe or critique any particular method. Rather, we'll base our studies on a set of overarching principles which can guide us and allow us to plan and deliver our lessons in an informed, principled way. These 12 principles come from Rod Ellis, one of the most respected scholars in our field. In this lecture, I'll explain each of these principles and ask you to reflect on them at the end. As you listen to the lecture, think about these questions. Which of these principles seemed obvious to you? If you are a teacher, which are you already following? In your own experience as language learners, which principles did your teachers use effectively? Which of these principles were new or surprising to you? In your future teaching, which seem most important to remember? Finally, are there any of these principles that seemed confusing or that you disagreed with? And I'll begin with a question, and that is, what does language proficiency mean? Or in everyday terms, what do we mean when we say someone speaks English well, or knows English, or doesn't know much English? It sounds so simple, but in fact, it's actually a fairly complex concept. And one of the reasons this concept of language proficiency is so complicated is that language proficiency is not just a single skill. Rather, it's a complex of overlapping, mutually reinforcing skills. And as language teachers, we need to be aware of all of these. I'll begin with vocabulary. You might think of vocabulary as being the most essential or foundational skill. After all, we can't say or understand anything without vocabulary, right? It's also one of the most challenging and daunting of skills, since students need to acquire literally thousands of word families to reach full proficiency in academic English. Next, we move on to grammar. Everyone knows that grammar can be challenging, but what you may not know, especially if you are a native speaker, is that the grammar that we teach or study in ESL or EFL is very different than the grammar that we learn in our native speaker English classes. It has a lot more to do with meaning, with mastering the grammatical structures we need to express meaning. In fact, many of the grammar points which native speakers find totally obvious, such as articles, a, and, the, are the most difficult for English language learners. And then there's speaking, which for many English learners is the most difficult skill, and we'll get into more of this later. Fluency is another interesting point because for people outside of our field, to be fluent or fluency is just a very general term. They ask, oh, are you fluent in English? Do you speak fluent Spanish? Whatever. For us as teachers, as professionals, fluency has a much more specific meaning, and it has to do with being able to speak freely, naturally, in a relaxed way, without undue hesitation or pause, without undue effort, and especially without the time and effort needed for internal translation. Pronunciation is another huge issue. There are entire courses devoted to pronunciation. Again, this is an area which is very difficult for some learners and very easy for others. I think pronunciation, more than any other skill, is highly individualized. I sometimes compare it to musical ability or athletic ability. For some people, it's just the easiest thing in the world. For others, it takes years of effort and practice. Cultural pragmatics is another big issue. The whole point of what to say and where to say it and who to say it to, levels of formality, cultural expectations. This is another tremendous important component of language proficiency. The literacy skills of reading and writing, of course, are another really important area and a highly specialized area. The English alphabet, the correspondence between the symbol and the sounds, and that involves spelling, is very complicated and takes a lot of time for many students, especially if they're coming from a non-English alphabet. The discourse style of English writing may be very different from what students are accustomed to, and that may take some special instruction. Listening is at the end of the list, but maybe listening should be at the beginning, because listening is another foundational skill. If you think about first language acquisition, how we all learn to speak our native tongue as children, listening comes first. We spent years of listening before we began to speak. Listening comprehension is something that's often ignored because it seems invisible. It seems like it's just doing nothing. But listening, in fact, is a very complex skill and it needs to be taught. So all these things work together to create language proficiency. And in this course, we will address each of them separately, always with the knowledge, though, that they're not completely separate, that they overlap, and one reinforces the other. I want to continue now with some key vocabulary. And excuse me. I'll preface this by saying that the field of TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other languages, has its own jargon, its own vocabulary, its own terminology, just like every other field, and a lot of acronyms. Sometimes I lose track of them myself. So I'm going to define some things here for you, and what you may find throughout this course is you're going to run into terminology and say, yes, I know what that means, of course, but we may use it in a different way in this field. And the opposite may happen, where you keep hearing this term, you keep hearing this phrase, and you have no idea. This is something you've never heard before. So please forgive me if I'm defining things that are already very obvious to you. And on the other hand, if I'm using terms or the book is using terminology that's unfamiliar to you, please ask. It's never a problem. Okay, so language acquisition. In this field, language acquisition has a very specific meaning. It means internalizing a second language, making it your own so that it can be used functionally, effectively, easily, without internal translation or undue effort. Okay. Now, that is contrasted to language learning. Language learning is the traditional process that we may have all gone through if you've taken Spanish or French or other languages in school, where essentially what you're often doing is learning about the language rather than actually internalizing it. So you learn the grammar, the pronunciation, you memorize a lot of vocabulary, but you really can't put that knowledge into action through communication, not very effectively. So this is not to say that there's something wrong with language learning. There is a very definite use for it. But we need to distinguish between the two. And of course, our ultimate goal is language acquisition. Fluency, as I mentioned earlier, the ability to speak Also sometimes used for reading and writing, smoothly, fairly quickly, without undue hesitation, effort, or awkwardness. Now, we often contrast fluency with accuracy because they are not necessarily found together. Sometimes they are, but often students have one and not the other. Accuracy is the ability to speak, read, or write with only a few and/or minor mistakes which do not interfere with communication. So especially when we get into the higher levels, more advanced levels, you may have students who seem very fluent, they can speak with great ease, but there are a lot of mistakes. And what we see sometimes, you may not see it as often, we see it more often at the ELI, is students who really understand the rules of English, and you can see that very well, especially when they take tests, because they have a very fine sense of accuracy, but the fluency is lacking. Their speech is extremely hesitant. Sometimes they simply can't speak because they're thinking so carefully, trying to put all the rules together, trying to figure out the right way to say something that nothing ever comes out. So we are always looking for a balance between those two. And a bit more vocabulary before we finish. Inductive approach, meaning to begin with a meaningful whole, a main idea, a text, preconceived knowledge, and then figuring out the component parts, breaking it down into parts. This is a top-down approach. Deductive approach, of course, is the opposite, beginning with the individual parts, for example, vocabulary or grammar structures, and then using that to construct a meaningful whole, a text. This is a bottom-up approach. We use the abbreviation L1 for a person's first language, their mother tongue. We use L2 for their second language, the target language, in our case, English. SLA, second language acquisition. Meta language, this is language about language, usually grammar terminology, words like noun, verb, subject, object, and so on. And extensive reading, this is used in a very specific way in this field. It means individually reading large amounts of easy material, usually fiction, hopefully for pleasure. This would be a situation where giving students a small graded reader or picture book, storybook, whatever to read at home for fun, and it really focuses on the volume of reading. We're not talking about analyzing page by page, sentence by sentence. We're talking about reading entire books. Okay, so let's go into these principles now as set forth by Rod Ellis. Very good quote here to begin. Language acquisition as taking place in the mind of the learners as a result of attending to and processing the input that they are exposed to. Okay, that's a very rich quotation in my opinion. What does it mean? It means that for language acquisition to take place, we as teachers cannot reach in and control the learner's mind, right? The art of teaching language lies in controlling the input that they are exposed to, while directing their attention and their processing of that input. This is often done by assigning specific tasks, and also eliciting appropriate output. So these are the things as teachers that we can control: the input, the task, and the output. And if we do that skillfully, hopefully, the language acquisition will take place. So let's begin looking at some of these principles that Ellis has given us. Principle number 1 is about 2 competences, or competencies if you prefer. And here's what Ellis says. Instruction needs to ensure that learners develop both a rich repertoire of formulaic expressions and a rule-based competence. So what are these and what's the difference? Let's start with the first. Formulaic expressions are fixed expressions, and they have a very clear communicative function. They don't require any kind of analysis or taking apart or anything. You can almost view the whole phrase as a single word. These are expressions like excuse me, can I help you, can I have one, please, thank you, I don't understand, where's the whatever, what's your name, my name is, could you speak more slowly, could you repeat that? These are set phrases that students need to know. And now we move on to the rule-based competence. This is what's traditionally been taught in foreign language classes throughout the world. This may have been taught in your own classes when you studied a foreign or second language. It's mostly grammar and to some extent vocabulary and pronunciation. It's learning the rules, taking tests, analyzing, maybe translating. Does it work? Unfortunately, the result of this kind of teaching is often a complete lack of fluency or the ability to communicate. Is it needed? Yes, it is needed. Is it sufficient to ensure successful communication? No. And we'll talk about later how to use these rules in a communicative way. But as I say, that's later. The next question, do formulaic competence and rule-based competence reinforce each other? And the answer is yes. Of course, students need both, as Ellis pointed out. It's more effective to focus on formulaic competence at the beginning and then transition to the rules later. Now, very important, I really regard this as a cardinal principle. Instruction needs to focus on meaning, right? Language has only one purpose, to communicate, to convey meaning. And children know this instinctively. They would see no other reason to learn language. This includes the lexical meaning, that is the definition, you might say, of each word, and the pragmatic meaning, how, where, and when to use a word or phrase or structure. Focusing on meaning is motivating, right? We're much more motivated to use the language when we really want to say something and when we really stand behind what we say. We're much more likely to remember vocabulary after using it in a meaningful way. This principle, I think, really cuts through everything we do in language teaching. And of course, to keep things in balance, we also need to focus on form. So, what does that mean? Focus on form is a standard phrase in this field. It means that, yes, we begin with meaning, we begin with engaging input, meaningful output, but in doing so, naturally, we're going to use grammatical structures. We're going to use a subject and verb. We're going to use the past tense. We're going to use direct objects, whatever. Some of this will be new and familiar, and some will be familiar. Focus on form means the instructor, that's you, highlights selected structures, directs students to notice them, explains them as needed, showing how they contribute to meaning, provides additional practice with these structures if needed. In other words, this is a top-down inductive approach. We begin with meaning, and then we point out the forms that we're using to create this meaning. Of course, this is going to depend on the age of your students. As students get older and more cognitively developed, we can focus on form more. In one of the videos that we watched this week, you will see this done very clearly, how the instructor focuses on form using the past tense and the present perfect. And Ellis's next principle is that implicit comes before explicit. As he says it, instruction needs to be predominantly directed at developing implicit knowledge of the second language, while not neglecting explicit knowledge. Remember earlier when we looked at vocabulary terminology of this field, we talked about the difference between acquisition and learning. Well, acquisition is implicit knowledge. It's the ability to use the language naturally to internalize the vocabulary and the structures in such a way that you can use them to express yourself without having to worry about the grammar or the vocabulary or the pronunciation. This is our ultimate goal. However, we also need a certain degree of explicit knowledge. That is, the rules of grammar. I say, I walk, you walk, he or she walks. We need that S, right? That sort of thing has to be taught as a rule. Vocabulary. Some vocabulary will be learned naturally. Other vocabulary is going to have to be memorized. Spelling. Some people are gifted enough to just pick up spelling naturally. Most people have to be taught spelling, right? It takes a lot of practice. So we need both. The key to effective explicit language instruction is to make sure that the instructed knowledge that we're teaching, the rules, the structure, whatever it is immediately put into use and practiced in meaningful communication. To use a negative example once again, many of us, again, that took foreign language classes in high school or even in college and came out of the class with no ability to communicate at all. The reason for that is we learned all these rules, we learned this vocabulary, we never were given chances to put it into use. And in fact, if you don't put it to use immediately for real, genuine communication, it won't be retained, it won't become implicit. And here's the next principle, the quote, built-in syllabus. Instruction needs to take into account the learner's built-in syllabus. Now, what we're talking about here primarily is grammar, grammatical structures, sentence structures. And it seems, research seems to indicate that language learners in both their first language and second language tend to acquire and master certain sentence structures in a natural order. Okay, so it makes sense, of course, as I wrote here, to collaborate with nature, to follow that order in our teaching. It's not always possible to do that, but it's good to be aware of it. There's a nice brief explanation or description of that on page 6 of your Teaching Science to ELL's book. So that doesn't mean that we as teachers simply have to wait for nature to take its course in our students, because research shows that formal instruction can increase the rate at which learners acquire grammatical structures. And some research shows that instruction can also change the order, that the natural order can be superseded with effective instruction. There are also complicating factors with the student's native language, which of course will have an effect and influence on how they learn English. Again, the example of the third person singular S. I walk, you walk, he, she, or it walks. That is a classic example because according to the natural syllabus, that particular feature comes very late. And we see that all the time in our students here at the ELI, even at a very advanced level where they're almost ready for academic reading and writing, they still forget that S. And there are many reasons for that, but one of them is looking at the natural or the built-in syllabus. That's a very, very late feature. Now, does that mean we shouldn't wait until a student's been studying English for 10 years before we teach that? Of course not. That's something that's usually taught at the very beginning. And it should be taught at the very beginning because some students will memorize it and remember it and use it. Most students will remember it some of the time, and then they'll have to be reminded again and again and again and again. And that's fine. That's what we do. Here's the next principle, number 6, extensive L2 input. Successful instructed language learning requires extensive L2 input. In other words, more is better. Okay, so the more input of English that the learners are receiving, the better it is. But the input needs to be comprehensible and meaningful. And that, those are the key words. Those things don't always happen easily or naturally. Comprehensible, it needs to be at a level that they can understand, which could be really challenging if their language proficiency is very low, if they're just beginners. And meaningful, of course. But I'll also add to that, and this is something we'll get into later, is this concept of I+1, which is a very influential concept in language pedagogy. I+1 means intelligible input plus 1. It means that the ideal input would be language that the student almost completely understands, but there's a little extra that they don't understand, and they can use what they do understand to figure out what they don't understand. Okay? It's
Hard to explain, but it's really very easy. And if you think about how children, how babies, how toddlers grow up, that's the way it always is. Parents use the language which they will understand, but there's always a bit more. There's always something added on, some extra vocabulary or concept which is new, and the child can figure it out because he or she has the foundation, the context to put the pieces together and then figure out that missing piece. That is the ideal input. Inside and outside of class. Okay, so outside of class is pretty hard to control. And we can't always do that. And in fact, what the author, Ellis, is talking about here is primarily students who are studying as adults, and in which case they're in immersion programs or in some situation where we can encourage them and provide some incentive for them to use English outside of class. For children, it's plus and minus. Of course, they've got the playground, they've got the street, they've got after-school activities. They are getting a lot of English outside of class. Now, what happens at home, they have their home language, and that is something that we can't control, of course. And it's important to add here that this does not imply that exposure to the learner's native language at home is damaging in any way. On the contrary, research clearly demonstrates that the ideal situation is for students to gain proficiency in both languages, L1 and L2. And in section 1.4 of Teaching Science to ELLs, that research is set forth, and it is very conclusive. So the one thing we do not want to do is in any way discourage or devalue the use of the home language, because cognitively students do much better if they are allowed and encouraged to continue to grow and to develop in both languages. Now, I'll also mention here extensive reading, because as soon as students have the literacy skills to read on their own, to read simple readers for pleasure, the more exposure to reading that they have, the better it is, both silent reading and being read to. You know this, of course. It's the same with native speakers. With reading, more is better. But of course, we hasten to add that output is equally essential. When we look at first language acquisition, babies and toddlers, of course, they're flooded with input, and that becomes the foundation for language acquisition. However, the children that we're dealing with in school, of course, are well beyond that stage. And for them, output is also essential. Why? Several reasons. First of all, output serves to generate and to modify and to influence input, right? You can't get an answer if you can't ask a question. So asking questions is a great way for students to generate input that will be meaningful and intelligible, comprehensible to them. Output challenges students. It challenges them to use what they're learning, to consolidate, to put the pieces together, to experiment with new vocabulary, with new grammatical structures, to gain feedback on their own skills, to increase fluency, automaticity, to be able to speak more effortlessly, more naturally, and very important to identify with the second language, to make it their own, to develop their own voice in English. So that's, again, one of our major opportunities and challenges as teachers, is to create opportunities for meaningful output. And the next principle, number 8, interaction. Of course, unless you sitting in front of a computer talking to a screen, as I'm doing right now, language is primarily a social phenomenon, right? Usually language is something that exists in a social context. So, of course, language proficiency, both in the first language and in the second language, develops naturally through social interaction. So how can we facilitate that? Okay, so let's start with how we don't facilitate that. If the teacher is standing in front of the class doing all the talking, the students are listening, or perhaps they're not listening, perhaps they're bored or fooling around or looking out the window or sleeping, there's no interaction. Students, for the most part, need to interact with each other. Okay, this means pair work and group work, and to some extent, answering questions from the teacher, interacting as a group with the teacher. Good ESL classrooms tend to be very noisy, and that's a good thing. Personally, I get very nervous if my classes are too quiet or if I'm doing all the talking. Teachers love to talk. I love to talk. The best learning happens, I think, when I shut my mouth and get the students talking, in English, of course. So how do we do that? That's a big question, but here are some good guidelines. Create situations in which students have a reason to communicate, all right? As a teacher, you set up the situation where the students have to convey some meaning to a partner or to a group. Give students opportunities to express themselves in ways that are meaningful to them, that are relevant to them, that they can really invest themselves in, that they can become engaged. Build in some flexibility, give students some control over what they're saying, over what they're talking about. Challenge students to communicate in ways that are just beyond their comfort zone. This goes back to the I+1 concept, where they're going to use the language resources they have, the vocabulary, the structures, and they're challenged to move just beyond that, to try something new. And of course, you're going to provide the scaffolding as needed for that. And finally, provide a variety of contexts, a variety of topics, and a variety of tasks. Something just fell off my desk. Anyway, tasks is a big deal. Tasks is kind of a key word here. We have a whole chapter coming up here on tasks, so we'll get to that soon. Principle 9, individual differences. Instruction needs to take into account individual differences in learners, learning styles. So you know this, of course, very well. I think teachers of children know this better than anyone. But in second language acquisition, this takes on some new dimensions because language is very personal, okay? Language is just not some external thing we learn about. Language is something that really becomes part of us. Second language acquisition takes place in highly individualized ways. Same as first language acquisition. If any of you have children or you've dealt with young children, you see that the way that they acquire language, each person does it in their own way. Of course, as teachers, we can't identify or accommodate each individual learner's preferences, each learner's style, but we can do certain things. We can be flexible. We can incorporate a variety of activities using a variety of learning styles: auditory, visual, social, kinesthetic, musical, and so on. By the way, the chapter we'll be doing in the coming week on teaching children just gives so many great examples of this, and you'll see those and read about them. We can help learners become aware of their own learning style. This is called metacognition. Students becoming aware of their own thinking, right? Thinking about how they think, how they learn, learning about how they learn. Encourage them to experiment with alternatives, to try new ways. Foster motivation. Of course, with children, we never let go of this. We never forget the importance of motivation. Keep learning fun. Provide numerous opportunities for success. Maintain awareness of short-term and long-term goals. The next principle involves assessment, and I don't want to say a great deal about that because we'll go into it in more depth later, and it is a fairly complex area. Also, in many cases, teachers don't have a lot of control over the assessments that they're required to give. In many countries, there are standardized tests which are given to all students in English. In ESL environments, for example, in American public schools, teachers are often required to give tests that are designed for native speakers, which obviously don't assess the ESL students very well. However, to the extent that a teacher does have control over the assessments that he or she gives, it's good to have a balance between free and controlled assessments. Controlled assessments are sort of the traditional paper and pencil tests. Free assessments are more assessments of what students are doing in class when they're engaged in discussions or games or whatever class activities you're doing, more formative assessments. Also, it's good to base assessments on what students can actually do with the language, as opposed to the more traditional
multiple choice or objective sorts of assessments. You might want to take a look at the WIDA Can-Do standards, which are available to you under links to useful resources. Um, these are very sophisticated and detailed standards based on what students can actually do with the language, and in that sense they're very useful.
Principle 11 is talking about language, and I think this is a really important one, and it's one you might not naturally think of. As Ellis says it, learners need to engage collaboratively in talk about linguistic problems and try to agree on solutions to them. That's a very interesting idea. Try to agree on solutions to them. What does that mean? I wouldn't have understood this so well if I didn't see it happen constantly in my own classes, where I'll put students in pairs or in small groups where they'll be working on some sort of exercise, grammar, vocabulary, whatever it is, a writing task, whatever it is. And it's difficult, and they're working together, and they don't always agree. The answer is not completely clear to them. They may have differing opinions, they may argue about it, but the process is very productive because almost invariably, when they come to an agreement, it will be correct. It just seems to work that two heads or three or four work much better than one. And not only does it work better, but it enables them to retain that knowledge much more effectively, because the act of actually struggling with this makes an impression, and sort of coming out on the other side and figuring out the answer is very gratifying. It's an experience of success. And as I say, it makes a deep impression. So this is a very productive use of class time, I think, to have students work together, solve problems that are actually about the language itself. Of course, you can't do this all the time. The students need to engage in other tasks too, but at least a certain percentage of time needs to be used for this, and more so as students get into more advanced levels, I think. And finally, last but not least, the subjective factor. As Ellis says, instruction needs to take into account the subjective aspect to learning a new language. And this is huge. As I mentioned before, learning a new language is not like learning history or science or even learning language arts for a native speaker. It goes very deep. It means gaining a new culture, and in some sense even a new personality. That may seem like a strong statement, but if any of you have had the experience of immersing yourself in a new culture and becoming fluent in a second language, it does seem like you sort of add a personality. Some people experience this more than others. I often ask my students this, do you feel like you have a new personality when you speak English, and do you like it or dislike it? I get such a variety of answers. Some of them say no, that they don't see any change in their personality, and that's fine. Others say yes, they do acquire a new personality. And then in answer to the next question, do you like it or dislike it? Again, I get a whole range of answers. Some students say they really like the new personality they gain in English, that it allows them a new degree of freedom in some cases, or ways of saying things or being that they never had the chance to do, never had the chance to think of in their native language. It allows them to connect with people from other countries in ways that didn't exist for them before. Others dislike the feeling, and this is an experience I've had, that in speaking a second language, they feel, frankly, stupid. They feel very limited. They feel, that they've regressed. They've lost a certain personal, personal power. But anyway, every person experiences a new language differently. But the point is that it is a very powerful experience, a very compelling experience. It can be exciting, it can be threatening, it can be scary, it can be confusing, it can be attractive, it can be rewarding, it can be frustrating. It can be all of these at different stages. And I think universally for everyone, it takes time. It takes time. It's easier for some people than for others. The time factor, children have an advantage in that they're starting early. They have an advantage in that they may not be aware of what's ahead of them, how many thousands of words they're going to have to learn. They may not be aware of, how challenging it will be, and that's a good thing. But on the other hand, of course, for children it can be very, very threatening and frightening and confusing in many ways, intimidating. It's probably helpful for teachers to be aware of this, to help to lead children through this in a developmentally appropriate, age-appropriate way. Let them know that the new language, the new culture are not by any means a rejection or a negation of their home culture, that those things remain very precious, very valuable, and they always will be. This is, again, set forth quite clearly, I think, in Teaching Science to ELLs in section 1.5 and 1.6. And research bears this out, that students need to continue growing in their home culture, their home language, as well as English, if at all possible.
I'll end the lecture by asking you to reflect on what you've heard today, and to do some writing under the discussion assignment in this module. These are the same questions I asked at the beginning of the lecture. Which of these principles seems obvious to you? If you're a teacher, which are you already following? In your own experience as a language learner, which principles did your teachers use and which were used effectively, which worked? Which principles are new or surprising in your future teaching? Which do you think are most important to remember? That might be the most important question. And finally, do any of these principles seem confusing to you? And are there any that you disagree with? And you can be honest about that.